Excellent.
All right.
I'll hit start on that. I'm drinking my water.
In that case, hello everyone. I'm Jenny, and this is Fox. I'm a conservator who also runs a podcast called The C Word, the Conservators Podcast.
And I do lots of things, but today I'm wearing my podcast sound engineer hat.
So before we get started, I'd just like to know how many people in the room actually listen to podcasts? Hands up.
Nice.
Brilliant. Nice. For those in the room who might be unfamiliar, I'm just going to give a quick definition as written by Hannah Hethmon in her recent and excellent book, Your Museum Needs a Podcast. Podcasts are serialized audio distributed through a feed. Now that feed thing matters because it's something you can subscribe to. Our website is just somewhere that you go. Podcast listeners will listen to you on apps and using programs like iTunes, and those things will check for new episodes for them. Basically, the content comes to them, not the other way around. But we'll get into that later. Podcasts can be any length. Museum Archipelago, for example, they have a 15-minute format, and that's released fortnightly. But then there are podcasts out there that are 2 or 3 hours long per episode, released weekly. So we're somewhere in between, where we do an hour to an hour and a half fortnightly. But basically, you can do anything that you'd like. So to summarize, a podcast is an audio thing with some people talking, going out to subscribers, and they can be about anything that you'd like. Now we can get on with the talk. Our workshop here today is called Podcasting Practicalities, because we're going to be dealing with people, equipment, where to record, editing, legal stuff, and hosting. As mentioned earlier, I'm actually a conservator, so this podcasting stuff isn't something I get paid to do, but it is something I enjoy. What I'm saying is that I'm a museum person, and that's who this talk is for. Specifically museum people who think, hey, I have this thing that I really want to talk about, but they're not really sure how to get from that to something that people listen to on their phones. So we're here to try to fill some of the gaps in that journey. So what's the first thing you're going to need? At least one person willing to do the talking. You don't actually need more than one, but personally I find it really intimidating to be alone with a microphone in a room. So as soon as you put one or two other people in with me, I'm a right chatterbox and it's really natural to me. But it's whatever works for you. 3 people is a really good mix, but you can have more or less. That's up to you. Realistically, making more than 3 people appear in the same room at the same time is a logistical nightmare, so you might find that that's the limiting factor. It's also a bit tricky from an audio point of view, but Fox is going to cover that later. You might be wondering if you actually need to be in the same room, in the days of Skype and all that. But we found that it really makes a huge difference to the chemistry between the people. So we tried this a couple of weeks ago where we actually all Skyped in to record the show, and we all hated it because we just couldn't keep the conversation natural. But we found the remote calls actually work really well for things like interviews, because that's kind of always a bit more formal. I ask a question and they give an answer, so it's less conversation and it's more Q&A, so that works really well. You'll need to think about who your hosts are going to be. Some shows have the same people on every week, and they become the voice of your show. Other podcasts have a life of their own, and they can have a different host every week. So don't feel like you have to pick one or the other. You can play with this and find a format that works for you. You can also choose to have a guest or 2 each episode. They could be hosting or they could be interviewees. So ideally you need 2 to 3 people together in a room. Well, what's next?
I'll shift you over and say that next, I'd say you probably need something to talk into, microphones and that. However, before we get into that stuff, I need to say something about me, and that is I'm not a perfectionist. I'm not sort of slavishly dedicated to getting the best sound quality and damn the consequences, because this is about practical reality. It'd be lovely if we could all have a soundproof room to record in, but yeah, that's not what most of us have to deal with. My goal with sound engineering is to try to make the audience feel like they're kind of hanging out in the same room as the speakers, and the speakers aren't just in some remote room somewhere, they're just sort of there, And if I can do that without massively inconveniencing the host and the museum, and ideally not bankrupting everyone at the same time, that would be perfect. So, equipment. This can be a bit of a scary subject. I'm thinking sort of some shivers running down some spines in the room, but it's going to be okay. We're primarily dealing with podcasting in the UK. That's the context for this. And the reason I say that is because lots of podcasting resources deal with podcasting in North America. And they seem to have access to quiet spaces, large spaces, away from everything. And we're not generally that lucky. Usually we're in an office somewhere, or a living room, or a shed, or something. So for the C word, we generally record in our living room. That's not just a bit of trivia. That's because I want you to think about the sound environment we're in. There's a hard floor, but we've got a large carpet covering almost all of it. Hard walls around us, but whole of one wall is just a big chunky sofa. And we've also got floor-to-ceiling curtains. The general idea being to remove hard surfaces for sound to bounce off. At the moment you can hear it echoing slightly off the walls. Not a problem here, but we're taking a direct recording. Let's see, losing my place a little. Got to stick to script, or I will ramble. Here we go. Pretty much the polar opposite of that sound environment would be public lavatories. High ceilings, tile surfaces, lingering smell. Smell is incidental, but the other things really factor into how the sound behaves. And the reason echo is such a big deal is because you cannot get rid of it. You cannot fix bad audio. If you end up with a recording with echo on, you're stuck with it. Now, there are reasons you might want an echo. Maybe you're interested in doing a spooky Halloween episode for whatever reason. But you can add echo in post. You cannot take it away. Right. So the takeaway for you here is that you need soft surfaces that absorb sound. If you're recording in an office, try to get one with wall-to-wall carpets, if possible. If there are tables in there, tablecloths. Even if it's only towels you're putting down, cushions, anything, draw the curtains. Yeah, anything to eliminate just hard surfaces that sound bounces off.
So that's something to factor into your setup time. So if you've got an office where you know that you're going to be recording, you're going to need to factor in that you're going to put some blankets down and get your best throw cushions out from home, and then pack that away again. So just factor that in.
Other things, because that's dealing with how the sound reacts. Then we've got sources of noise. So at least what I've experienced, air conditioning units, fans, fridges, they're particularly bad, especially if they just kind of click on just at the wrong time. You end up with this horrible burbling noise in the background. Windows open if there's busy traffic, stuff like that. The odd ringing phone, or if you've forgotten to turn notifications off on your phone when you're recording, that's not actually that big a deal and doesn't, it's not a huge problem. But if there's just a constant burbling in the background, A, you can't get rid of it in post, and B, it just sounds kind of horrid. Yeah, losing my place again. We're down to there. So that's environmental stuff. I was supposed to talk about equipment, wasn't I? Well, the reason I'm covering the environmental stuff first is because it really informs which equipment you're going to need, because I don't know what kind of recording spaces you're going to have access to. So let's see. Equipment. Essentially, for our purposes, there are two types of microphone: dynamic and condenser. I could get into the technical details to a certain extent, but it's not hugely important. We're going to think instead about studio microphones and stage microphones. In principle, they both convert wiggly air into electrical signals, but beyond that, they do it in slightly different ways. Stage microphones are rugged, not all that sensitive, ideal for karaoke. You're sort of good for shouting into, things like that. Studio microphones, generally a lot more delicate, sensitive, and that's kind of a blessing and a curse. So for our show, we actually use stage microphones, Shure SM58s. They're not perfect, but they work for us, and it's what we happen to have. It's quite a complicated setup, and I wouldn't recommend it to you guys starting out, but it's what we have. And the reason we've made that choice is because the only space we've got to record in is in the suburbs. There are neighbors with sort of TVs blaring. We've got a dog that just will not stop barking for hours on end. And by using these, we're able to filter out all of that. Let's see. And we do this because that's kind of what I've got. However, I think I need a new slide for this, because this is still a useful thing. These stage microphones, they're very directional. You have to get the host right in front, which is true of almost all mics. And this kind of informs what you need to be thinking about in terms of making your own recordings. You need your hosts as close as possible to your mics. Closer than that. Ideally as close as you can really get them. Sort of like that. So, you need mics, people, yeah. What to buy? Here's where it gets a bit tricky. Lots of you will have a budget primarily consisting of empty crisp packets and whatever someone's forgotten to throw out. And chances are no one's going to sign off on letting you buy a mixer and a load of microphones just to have a go at this podcasting lark. So, well, maybe you could get someone to sign off on getting you one mic, maybe. Yeah. I mentioned a mixer. In simple terms, it's a way of controlling how sensitive the microphones plugged into it are. If you've only got one microphone, you don't need to worry about that. The way you're controlling that mic is by making sure it's plugged in. So, what's it plugged into? Usually a computer of some kind, to be honest. Time was you plug it into a tape recorder or an MP3 player, but these days you're probably plugging it into a laptop and hitting record in some software. What kind of mic? That depends, and it depends on whether you are one person or several. If you're only ever going to be one person, that's easy. Get yourself an Audio-Technica ATR 2100, it's about 60 quid. It's not the best mic in the world, but it'll do you just fine. However, do not try to share this mic. It might work, I haven't really tried it out for that, but if you're planning on doing a podcast where there's multiple hosts or you're going to be interviewing someone, you're going to be sharing a mic. Buy a microphone for sharing. Oh yeah, I did want to say that details of these mics and things are in the handouts, so we've got a pile of over there. So, my two cheap recommendations for shared mics would be the Blue Snowball Ice, it's about 45 quid, or the Samsung Go, again, about 45 quid. Set them in the middle of a table, get your host close, it'll be fine. Won't be the best ever, but it will do the job. Then you had an interjection, except I've done that interjection for you, sorry about that. So, USB microphone, laptop, quiet room, that's one of your options. It's fairly cheap, but what if you have no budget at all? How about a mobile phone? Most of us have got them. It'd be a bit weird if we didn't these days. It's got a microphone with a voice recording app. You can make it work. With a bit of trial and error, you can get a fairly decent sound, or at least good enough.
So Chloe has done that for some of our interviews where she didn't have any gear with her, but there was an ideal opportunity to interview someone, so she popped just her phone on the table, and that sounded okay.
Really, with all this stuff, it comes down to finding a sweet spot. The fancier the equipment you've got, the sloppier you can be. With a phone microphone, you need to be in a very quiet room, ideally, careful positioning, but say you've got a mixer and fancy studio mics and a soundproof room, you just sort of push one of those extendy recording arms towards something and twiddle some knobs. But with the phone mic, well, the best way I found to illustrate this was I tried this out for myself. Put my phone on record in the middle of our kitchen table with me about a foot, half a meter away from it, something like that, and hit record. And it sounded okay. Then I shifted back just ever so slightly, and immediately much, much more echoey. So you've got to be close. I tried walking around to the other side of the table, so the microphone was facing that way and I was on the other side. A little bit muffled, but completely serviceable. And the main problem came when I leaned forward, because I'm engaging in the conversation, you know, I'm a bit interested. Lean forward, elbows on the table, boom, boom, immediately. Need to find that point I had on a bit of paper, you just get the rustling immediately, and that's going to apply to every host sitting around the table. So you need to be really careful if you're going the phone mic route. But it can work, and that's kind of the takeaway, that if you want to just get started in this, try it out, although make sure, keep the elbows off the table, don't touch it. I think you're up.
So if you've decided to record this on your phone, then you've ended up with a file of you guys talking that you're going to need to edit. And if you decided to go down the microphone and computer route, then you will need some sort of software to record yourselves with. Now, fortunately, there's something that solves both of those problems. It's a free piece of software called Audacity. That's going to be your savior. Basically, it's available for both Mac and Windows computers, and it can handle both your recording and your editing. I should probably clarify what I mean by editing. That's snipping out all the awkward bits, moving things around, maybe putting in some music, and making sure nobody swears, unless that's something that you actually want to go for. Editing audio sounds scary, but it isn't actually all that bad. I knew basically nothing about it when I started this 2 years ago. Fox showed me some basics, and then I just had a go. Now, the good thing about free software is that people out there are trying to figure out how it works. So there's a guide to almost everything. How much work you'd like to put into your editing work is entirely up to you. You can keep it simple, or you can make it as jazzy as you'd like. A simple edit would be something like trimming off the bit at the end where you're not quite sure if you've stopped or who's hitting the stop button on the recording, that sort of thing. Something more advanced might be putting music between different sections or messing with the equalization. And if you don't know what that means, that's okay. That's advanced stuff. If you really want to know about it, he can tell you later. By the way, editing is not a magic wand. There are some things that you just can't fix. We mentioned the room where you record in earlier and how you can't take away an echo. Well, you can make things less bad, but you can't undo good audio.
Bad audio.
Yeah, sorry, bad audio. This isn't CSI Miami. You can't enhance this, basically. If that's the only thing that you take away from today's talk, then you're way ahead of a lot of podcasts out there. Let's talk time. Whether you're being paid for this or not, you're going to end up spending time editing your audio. It's exceptionally rare for podcasts not to require any editing. So you'll need to be aware of the time implications. I easily spend a full working day, 8 or so hours, editing every episode. And that's for a 60 to 90 minute final product. That's because we record about 3 hours of material in one go, and to edit it, I have to listen to it all, usually more than once. It really helps to edit as soon as you've recorded something, because everything's still fresh in your mind, and you might think that's a really good bit I definitely want to keep, and that's going to help. But it does take time. I mentioned adding music to your show a little while ago. Now, you don't have to use music, but loads of podcasts out there have a little intro jingle, so you might want to consider it.
And then we got a little bit that I wish I didn't have to mention, but you can't just use any music you want. Music licensing is this whole thing, and, well, for the budget we're talking about here, it's just not going to happen. So if you're the BBC, then you can have whatever you want, but otherwise it gets expensive and messy.
But there are plenty of websites out there that do provide music that you can use under a Creative Commons license or similar, and those are up on screen, but they're also on the resource sheet that you can pick up on your way out.
I'm a massive nerd. Yeah, and so I'm familiar with Creative Commons, but I don't really expect anyone else to be. Creative Commons, they're a non-profit US organization that have tried to put together various different usage agreements, or licenses as we're going to call them, to try to make it easy for creative people to share and remix their work. Let's see, this sort of thing's become increasingly common in terms of making sure your stuff is appropriately licensed. The reason being, not in a scary, ooh, you're going to get in trouble kind of way, but no, it's more to do with that there's lots of automatic tools these days that scan uploaded things, and if they find any copyright infringing content, they flag them and take them down. So you'll have put in all this work recording and editing, and then no one will hear it. And, well, this would be a bit of a waste, wouldn't it? For the C word, the license we use is the Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial License. And that's essentially declaring that anyone can share the show, as long as they provide credit and don't charge for it. And the provide credit side of things is actually covered by just sharing the show, because it's a show. At the end, we say who we are and do our own credit. So that's already baked in. And the non-commercial bit, yeah, you don't get to sell it. Part of the reason I'm saying this is because these days we're all used to sharing things online, but it's sort of, here's a picture I saw, send it to a friend, that sort of thing. And from an intellectual property law type standpoint, it's not, it's actually a bit dodgy. The thing being, if you are the copyright holder, so in the case of your podcast, that's you have exclusive distribution rights. And that means that you're the only people who are allowed to share it. Other people aren't allowed, unless you explicitly say that they are. And that's why I'm encouraging you, pick a license that says you're allowed to share it, because of course you want your listeners to share it with their friends. I suppose colleagues, because we're talking museum stuff. Let's see, just making sure. Yep. There are other licenses out there, but I tend to like the Creative Commons ones because they're relatively easy to understand. But there's some resources on the handout that hopefully will help with this. And if you have any other questions, I will do my best to answer them. And I think you're up.
Yeah. So the reason we're mentioning that is because you need to pick music with a compatible license. Alternatively, you could just pay someone to create some music for you. There are lots of musicians in need of work out there, and on a website like Fiverr, it doesn't even have to cost the world. That's what we did when we needed an additional jingle for a new section of our show called Dear Jane. Basically, I messaged this guy on Fiverr, sent him our intro music, and asked him to create something that was a little bit like it. And it cost me about £5, so that's all right. Right, so now you've got a show, you've recorded it, you've edited it, and you've got some nice music that you're allowed to use. Now what? How do you get it to people? The next thing you'll need is hosting. And your hosting is where your podcast files live. They host the MP3 files for your show. Remember earlier when I said that a website is just somewhere you go? Well, the job of the podcast hosting service is to store your files and keep your feed updated.
So feed, we're getting technical here. I find the term pretty nebulous, but I'll put it in terms that make sense to me, and hopefully that'll work for you guys. A feed is a simple text file, and it contains links to episodes of your show. So when we're talking about subscribers, we're talking about people that have told their podcast app or program to check that file for changes on a regular basis. So every time you release a new episode, you'll put it on your hosting, and they'll automatically update that file. And so then your listeners, their podcast app will essentially go out and say, the file's changed, there's a new episode, and then they'll download it.
Now, that file isn't something that you ever need to worry about, because that is the job of your hosting service. They sort all of that for you. But what are your hosting options? Well, unless you've got a very tech-savvy IT department, you're going to have to go with a paid option for this. We've looked this up, and there are some names on screen. They're also on the handout. They're all at least $10 a month. I wish I could tell you there's a brilliant free option out there, but I'm going to be honest with you, they're all shite. They limit how big the files are or how many episodes you can upload, and it's just not worth it, not if you want to do this for real.
I mean, it's like 2 episodes or something like that. That's the kind of limit we're talking.
Yeah. Well, that's it. Like, once you've got your hosting solution, then you're ready to go. You are on air. Podcasting can be a very tricky journey with steep learning curves, but it's also extremely fun, really rewarding, and I recommend having a go. Now, if you're ever stuck, then you can come and talk to us at the C Word or Fox at Wooden Dice. Our details are on screen, but they're also on the handout if you need us. And if you'd like a bit of bedtime reading, I really recommend that book I mentioned earlier called Your Museum Needs a Podcast. I'm not being paid to plug that. I just read it and I really liked it.
I read a few of the chapters. It was all right.
Thanks so much for listening, guys. Does anyone have any questions? Yes. Yes.
Just with image and using intellectual property and copyright,
Yeah.
do you need to get permission from the guests that you have on a podcast? Do you need to get them to sign something just in case they go home and change their mind and say, actually, I don't really want to hear that?
I suppose that depends on how formal you want to be. If your institution feels like you need like a written agreement that, you know, you've done an interview with us and you're fine with this, you can go down that route. So it's not like it's necessary, it's not mandatory, but it depends on how much you want to safeguard yourself. Some people also let the guest like pre-approve an interview so that they listen to the interview before it goes out. But please bear in mind that can take extra weeks because people are busy and they don't have time or might not even want to listen to their own voice, even if it's just like a 10-minute clip. So if you do go down that route, that's significantly going to impact the scheduling of how quickly you can get things out. But yeah, it's an option. Yes?
I've seen some microphones that seem to plug directly into your mobile phone. Have you any experience of those?
I've not actually tried any, have you?
I haven't tried them either, but I would imagine they would probably work reasonably well for this sort of thing.
I've done one with that, not a podcast, it was one of those Facebook Live videos. And we actually used it outside.
Wow.
It worked pretty well.
Nice.
It had the fluffy bit around it.
Oh, yeah.
But
That's what I've seen.
it seemed to work well, and they used that outside on site tours
That's
inside.
good because that makes it really versatile.
Yeah.
for using that.
Sorry, there's a question over that. I interrupted.
Oh, yes.
I was wondering about the sort of audiences for the podcast versus the audience for the videos and things like that. What you found, who likes what or
That's a great question. So normally the kind of podcast audience is seen as people in their 20s and 30s. They are about a 50-50 split between men and women. So you are looking at a particular age group. That's not to say that older or younger people don't listen to podcasts, but it's just that the majority will fall in that category. With videos is interesting because it does depend on the subject matter almost more than the medium, but also if you're ever doing video, make sure that you caption it, because that means that more people watch your videos, which is an interesting fact that I just picked up last year, I think, at the museum's conference. But so I'm not sure about the audience of video per se.
But what about, do you know anything about when people listen to them as well? Is it, walking?
Oh yeah. So I mean, I can only be anecdotal with when people listen to our podcast, because we've asked them, when do you listen to us? And yeah, it's during their commute, when they're walking to work, or when they're cycling, or when they're on the bus. It can also be at home when they're doing some chores. But the second favorite option seems to be at work, because sometimes people just want to plug into something. They don't want to be bothered by their colleagues. They just go, okay, I'm just going to do my thing now, and that's when they listen to us, astonishingly.
Company in the lab.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah.
Over there.
Oh.
Hi, I'm Rachel from Mark One. I just want to say thanks for a really interesting talk, and also to Shames who've done our new podcast.
Nice.
Ooh.
Well done.
Tell us about it.
Media at the Museum.
Oh.
Last week, the second episode out.
Lovely.
And it's basically getting people together to go and visit a museum to try and inspire more people to go and kind of discover different culture. So
I want to listen to that.
To the Fashion and Textile Museum, and just today we've got Phil Wang going to the Bristol Museum. So please download, please listen, love to get your comments.
Yeah.
I'm happy to talk to anyone about it.
That sounds fabulous.
Can I ask a related question?
Yes.
How do you get your museum on it? How do you choose what museum
Oh.
on that?
Come and talk to me.
There you go, networking opportunity.
Yeah.
We did,
And
yeah.
what the upfront did was give them free tickets to Rich Gallagher, was it?
Oh, nice.
So they were talking about their business while they're walking around. The gallery, so it was really effective because they were talking about work handy.
Got a question, I think. At the moment.
Yes.
Cool.
International, but it's, and our kind of routine came through kind of advertising the National Art Class on podcasts, and like Adam Buxton, which is obviously one of the most kind of popular ones, and finding that it reaches a new audience and a real growing audience, and now creating our own podcast. So there's 6 episodes this year, and we're commissioning 6 episodes next year. So this series commission, but if you want to talk to us about ideas for next year, where all is. Sounds beautiful.
Nice.
Excellent.
The really nice thing is, museums we've used and paired up with them, 8 groups so far? 6. Is the kind of famous person, so the concept of that famous person brings their mum, their gran, their friend, whoever it is.
Ah.
Because we haven't just taken a celeb and put them somewhere that is someone that we want to push. They've genuinely said, my interest area is, natural history, fashion, football, national football museum, and for us it's a big thing to then sort of be engaging some of the male population with
Yeah.
comedians make it very funny and authentic. So it's really simple premise, which seems to be, like, as you say, these conversations.
Yeah. Oh, fabulous. Yeah.
Excellent.
I will definitely go and listen to that now. I'm fine with that. Any other questions? All right.
Tell them what you've left.
Yes. So on your way out, there are handouts with all the information that we've just told you about, plus a glossary, and there's also some cards if you ever want to, talk to us or anything. So yeah.
And
thanks so much.
I was just going to say that as I'm not a museum person, I'm just kind of be hanging around. So if you do want to pick my brain about anything, just go prod me.